If an arborist looks at a chopped down, dried out stump, the diagnosis is pretty binary. I mean, it is dead. Biology dictates it will never grow again. Welcome to reform thinking.
Yeah, and today we are looking at a king who completely defies that biological law. A king who is simultaneously the descendant of King David and the origin of King David.
Right.
It is a staggering paradox. We are looking at a progression of events that moves from absolute human ruin, which is represented by that dead stump, to a cosmic eternal reign. And along the way, this analysis aggressively challenges modern assumptions about grace, about justice, and, about the nature of the church itself.
And the goal of our time with you today is to unpack all of this thoroughly. We're initiating a massive deep dive into two incredibly thorough theological texts, analyzing Isaiah chapter 11, specifically looking at the title given to Jesus Christ, the root of Jesse. This is not some abstract biblical riddle meant for a seminary classroom. This is a core truth that reorients how you view history, how you view your own salvation, and how you view the future of the entire cosmos. But to understand this shoot that brings life, we first have to look at the dead wood.
Right, we have to go back to the historical background of the 8th century BC.
Because we are talking about a period of absolute geopolitical terror.
The historical context here is vital. You have to transport yourself to the ancient Near East during a time when the entire known world was shaking.
Oh, absolutely.
The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah are locked in this vice of fear. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is expanding under the leadership of a ruthless military commander named Tiglath-Pileser III.
Right, and to understand the psychological weight of this era, you have to realize this was not a minor border dispute. The Assyrian war machine was swallowing up surrounding nations with unprecedented violence.
Yes, they were notorious for psychological terror, mass deportations, and absolute devastation. I mean, they would leave pyramids of skulls outside conquered cities to send a message to anyone who dared oppose them.
Which is just a horrifying visual. And right in the middle of this panic, you have the southern kingdom of Judah and a king named Ahaz sitting on the throne in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Ahaz is faced with a terrifying political squeeze called the Syro-Ephraimite coalition.
Yeah.
Basically, Rezin, the king of Damascus, and Pekah, the king of Israel in the north, form an alliance.
Right.
And they want to force Judah into a rebellion against the Assyrian Empire. They figure if they can force Judah to join them, they might have a fighting chance against Tiglath-Pileser III. But Ahaz panics.
And King Ahaz fails spectacularly. He acts as an absolute coward.
Yeah.
Instead of trusting the Lord, instead of leaning on the promises God made to his ancestor David, Ahaz commits an act of total apostasy. He actually loots the gold and silver from the temple of God and sends it to Assyria as a bribe. He essentially sells his nation into pagan vassalage. The texts point out that this is a direct violation of the Davidic covenant established back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God promised that David's house and kingdom would be established forever.
Right. He trades divine sovereignty for a cheap, pragmatic political alliance.
Yes. He looks at the terrifying Assyrian army and decides that God's promises are not enough to protect him.
And that pragmatic alliance does not save them in the long run. It just delays the inevitable and compromises the nation. The historical record traces this downward spiral all the way to the Babylonian exile, which we read about in 2 Kings 25.
Just forward a few generations, and the mighty, sprawling tree of David's royal line is chopped down by the axe of divine judgment.
Yep.
Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned to the ground, and the last king of David's line to sit on the throne, Zedekiah, is forced to watch his own sons executed right before his eyes.
Which is so brutal.
It is, and then his eyes are gouged out. He is led away in bronze chains to Babylon.
And that is the specific imagery of the stump. The visible monarchy is entirely cut down. The crown is cast to the dirt. To the human eye, the royal covenant looks like it is completely collapsed. The people are scattered in a foreign land. It is a scene of total desolation and apparent covenant failure. When an Israelite looked at the royal family line after the Babylonian exile, they did not see a thriving tree. They saw a rotting, lifeless stump in the ground.
Which brings up a fascinating detail in the text that we have to pause and look at. Why does the prophet Isaiah say, "A shoot will come from the stump of Jesse"?
Yeah, that is a great question. Why not say the stump of David? I mean, David was the great king, the one who built the empire, the one who conquered Jerusalem. David is the name associated with glory and triumph.
Naming Jesse points to the total reduction of the royal house. By invoking Jesse, the text strips away all the palatial glory of Jerusalem. It bypasses the gold, the chariots, the ivory palaces, and returns the family to its pre-monarchical, humble status. Jesse was not a king. He was just a farmer in Bethlehem. He was a commoner keeping sheep. The royal line has been humiliated and reduced to the dirt. God is signaling that the coming restoration will not rely on the remaining prestige of the Davidic dynasty, because there is no prestige left.
It makes me think of a famous billionaire dynasty. Imagine a family that builds a massive global empire over a century. They have huge skyscrapers with their name on them, private jets, incredible wealth, and immense political influence.
Oh, sure.
And then through sheer corruption and terrible decisions, they lose absolutely everything. The empire goes bankrupt, the mansions are seized by the bank, the legacy is destroyed in public scandal.
Right.
And the great-grandchildren of the founder are reduced to the identical obscure working-class state that their great-grandfather started in, sweeping floors or working on a small farm. That is what happened to the line of David. They are back to square one, living in obscurity in Bethlehem, far removed from the throne room.
That analogy captures the humiliation well. The text forces the reader to confront the reality of this total devastation. And from that lifeless, humiliated stump, a biological impossibility is introduced. A green shoot pushing up from dead wood.
Yes.
Which brings us into the specific Hebrew vocabulary used by Isaiah. And this holds a massive theological riddle sitting right there in plain sight.
Let's investigate that vocabulary, because the linguistic precision here is incredible. In Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, the text uses the Hebrew words choder, meaning a shoot, and netzer, meaning a branch, to describe what grows from the stump.
Right.
It implies something springing forth from the lineage, a direct biological descendant. But down in verse 10, the text shifts its vocabulary entirely. It uses the word shoresh, which translates to root. It says the root of Jesse will stand as a signal for the peoples.
This is the absolute core of the text. This shift from shoot to root is not an accident of poetry.
So wait, how does this work practically? A shoot grows out of a stump, above the ground, taking life from the tree. But a root is what exists under the ground, before the tree even grows, providing the life to the entire organism. How can someone be the offspring of a family line, the shoot and the root of that same family line, at the identical time?
The authors connect this directly to the hypostatic union, the two distinct natures of Jesus Christ united in one person.
Yes.
As the shoot or the branch, Jesus is fully human. He is legally descended from David through Mary and Joseph, as we see carefully recorded in the genealogies of Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3.
Right. He was born in the lowly, obscure town of Bethlehem, fulfilling the prophecy of returning to the days of Jesse.
Exactly. I mean, he shares our human nature entirely, facing temptation, hunger, and physical exhaustion, yet remaining entirely without sin. He is the genuine biological fulfillment of the promise made to David's physical lineage.
But as the root, he is the eternal God. He is the self-existing creator. The Gospel of John and the letter to the Colossians make it clear that all things were made through him, and in him all things hold together.
Yes.
Before Jesse was ever born, the eternal Son of God existed. He gave Jesse his very breath, his very existence. He is the divine source that kept the covenant alive when the human elements failed. He's the one sustaining the root system underneath the soil of history, long before he incarnated as the shoot above the soil.
And we see New Testament echoes of this specific riddle. Jesus actually poses this theological puzzle to the Pharisees in Matthew 22.
Oh, that is a great connection.
He asks them, if the Messiah is the son of David, how can David, speaking by the Spirit, call him Lord? The Pharisees cannot answer because they only see the Messiah as a human shoot, not as the divine root.
Right.
And in the very last chapter of the Bible, Revelation 22, verse 16, Jesus claims both titles explicitly. He says, I am the root and the descendant of David. He claims both the origin and the conclusion of the covenantal line.
This proves absolute covenant fidelity. The unconditional royal grant given in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that David's throne would last forever is fulfilled completely. It proves God does not break his promises, even when human kings fail miserably.
Yeah, Ahaz failed. Zedekiah failed. The entire line of physical kings rebelled and brought destruction upon themselves. But God himself steps into history to fulfill the requirements of the covenant from both sides. He provides the human descendant required while being the divine king who ensures its success.
Because this king is divine, because he's the eternal root, his rule looks drastically different from the corrupt kings of Judah and drastically different from any modern politician.
Yes, the text transition from his origin to the nature of his reign. focusing heavily on the spirit-endowed nature of this new monarch.
Let's look closely at Isaiah 11, verses 2 through 5, detailing the sevenfold spirit resting upon him. It lists the spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and the fear of the Lord. This is not a partial endowment.
It is the absolute fullness of the Holy Spirit. Unlike King Saul, who experienced the Spirit temporarily, or the other kings of Judah who wavered in their devotion, this king is permanently endowed.
Right.
His mind is filled with divine truth, his decisions are shaped by perfect wisdom, and his authority is backed by omnipotent might. He does not need a cabinet of advisors, he does not need a strategy team to tell him how to govern.
And that leads to a huge contrast in verse 3 regarding perfect justice. The text explicitly says, "He will not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear."
Yeah.
Think about human courts for a second. Even the best legal systems in the world rely on incredibly flawed mechanisms. We rely on biased witnesses who might misremember details or outright lie. We rely on circumstantial evidence. We rely on clever lawyers who can spin a narrative to convince a jury.
Absolutely.
Human justice is entirely dependent on external appearances and hearsay. But this king needs no jury. He needs no witnesses. He has absolute omniscient access to the truth of every single human heart.
This brings us to the holy severity of his reign. The authors highlight the specific causative Hebrew verbs used in verse 4. It says, "He will smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked."
Wow.
His mere word has active judicial might. When he speaks, judgment is executed. There is no appeal process. His decree is absolute and final. The breath that sustains the universe is the same breath that strikes down the wicked.
Which is a sharp pivot from how many people view him today. The texts use this passage to directly critique modern, seeker-sensitive models of church life.
They do.
The argument here is that a lot of contemporary religion prefers a version of Jesus who never confronts sin, never calls for repentance, and acts more like an affirming therapist than a sovereign monarch. Reshaping Jesus into a harmless, non-confrontational mascot completely ignores the holy severity detailed in Isaiah 11. True justice includes striking down rebellion.
A king whose belt is righteousness and faithfulness cannot trim his judgments to fit human marketing strategies. He does not soften his demands to increase attendance. And it is precisely this perfect, unyielding justice that paves the way for what comes next.
Right.
Perfect justice clears the ground for perfect peace. You cannot have cosmic shalom while rebellion is allowed to fester.
The texts dive into this incredible imagery of Edenic restoration in verses 6 through 9. The wolf dwells with the lamb, the leopard lies down with the goat, the calf and the lion are together, and a nursing child plays near the hole of a cobra. Predators and prey living side by side without fear.
Yeah, it is a beautiful picture.
Now, when I read about wolves and lambs hanging out, my modern brain immediately writes this off as just pretty poetry for world peace. Feels like a metaphor for nations laying down their weapons. Are these authors actually arguing for literal biological changes to animal digestion and behavior?
They absolutely are. The authors advocate for a literal physical renewal of the earth. They operate from a pre-millennial view, meaning they anticipate a future literal reign of Christ on earth.
Oh, okay.
The texts specifically reject reading this as just social progress or a metaphor for human diplomacy. The curse that entered creation through human sin in Genesis chapter 3 is literally rolled back. The hostility in the animal kingdom, the predatory nature of beasts is removed. Creation itself is liberated from its bondage to decay.
And the text gives a specific reason for this safety. Verse 9 provides a direct causal link. The earth experiences this absolute cosmic safety because it is full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Right.
The universal shalom is a direct result of the universal knowledge of God. Peace is not achieved by mankind finally learning how to get along. Peace is achieved because the King's holy presence saturates every inch of the globe.
And that global reach is cemented in verse 10. The root of Jesse stands as a banner, a rallying signal for the Gentile nations. The Apostle Paul quotes this specific verse in Romans chapter 15 to prove that God's plan always included saving people from every global tribe.
Right.
He unites Jew and Gentile under one king. The localized promises made to the physical line of David explode into a global, cosmic reality. The banner is raised high enough for the ends of the earth to see it and stream toward it.
Okay, so we have covered a massive amount of historical and prophetic ground. But how does this ancient royal prophecy impact how you, the listener, are saved today? The authors draw a direct line to the doctrines of grace.
They explain how the stump imagery destroys human-centered theology, specifically targeting systems like Arminianism or synergism. The logic is quite stark. A
Yeah.
dead stump cannot choose to grow. It has no internal life force remaining. It cannot generate a shoot through its own willpower. The emergence of the shoot is a sovereign, miraculous, monergistic act of God alone. Monergistic meaning God acts alone in the work of regeneration.
It is like trying to resuscitate a piece of chopped firewood. You can take a piece of dry firewood, stick it in the dirt, water it all day, give it sunlight, maybe even speak encouraging words to it, but it is never going to grow roots.
No, it is not.
It needs a supernatural act of creation to bring it back to life. That is how the authors view the human heart before salvation. We are spiritually dead, dry wood. The Holy Spirit has to perform a sovereign act of regeneration to give us life so that we can even recognize the King. We do not cooperate with grace to become alive. Grace makes us alive so that we can respond.
That is the essence of monergistic salvation discussed in the text. God acts decisively, and this fits seamlessly into the Reformed view of the covenant of grace. The authors stress that God's dealings with Israel and his dealings with the New Testament church are not two unrelated experiments.
Right.
They are not disconnected backup plans or completely separate dispensations of grace.
The promises made to Abraham about blessing the nations, the promises made to David about an eternal throne, and the promises made to the church all find their single focal point in the root of Jesse. There's one unified plan of redemption running through all of human history. The church is grafted into this singular covenantal olive tree.
These doctrines do not just establish a theological framework, they actively tear down modern cultural frameworks that attempt to compete with the king's absolute authority.
We need to look closely at the specific cultural critiques the authors raise. And I want to frame this carefully for you listening. We're looking strictly at how the authors of these texts argue against these movements as reporters of their work. The authors explicitly call out several modern movements, naming social justice and critical race theory.
Yes.
They argue these are secular, Marxist-derived ideologies of grievance that the church should reject.
The rationale the authors provide is that true cosmic justice and equity are achieved only through the execution of the king's law. They argue that attempting to achieve justice through political activism or treating the church like a political action committee replaces the sovereign action of Christ with humanistic schemes.
Right.
They frame these modern ideological movements as incompatible with the biblical mandate, viewing them as man-made attempts to engineer a utopia without the requirement of the king's holy presence.
The texts also systematically refute several other interpretations that they consider false. For instance, they critique the prosperity gospel. They point out that the king comes from a stump, which signifies a path of suffering before glory. There is a cross before a crown.
Absolutely.
The promise is not earthly wealth or a life free of hardship. If the king of the universe had to be humiliated and reduced to a humble shoot before ascending to the throne, his followers should expect to walk a similar path of suffering in this life.
They also reject mysticism. The texts warn against viewing the root as some sort of secret inner energy or hidden potential that individuals can unlock through special spiritual techniques.
Yeah.
Faith must look outward to the objective, historical, physical person of Jesus Christ, not inward to subjective experiences or emotional highs. Our salvation is anchored in an objective historical event, not in our fluctuating internal feelings.
And they tackle religious pluralism head-on. The authors insist that the text presents Jesus as the absolute only banner for the nations. He's entirely exclusive. He's not one path among many. He's the sole source of life for everyone.
Right.
The text leaves no room for multiple valid religious systems. The nations must stream to the root of Jesse, or they remain under judgment.
Taking all of this massive theology into consideration, the texts bring it down to daily application. What does it look like to live under the authority of the root of Jesse on a Tuesday morning? They explain a concept known as the third use of the law.
Which means that believers, having been filled with the same Holy Spirit that rested upon Christ, now walk in grateful obedience. We are called to exhibit wisdom, counsel, and the fear of the Lord in our daily vocations. The law is no longer a tool of condemnation that terrifies us, but a guide for how to live out our gratitude to the King who saved us.
The authors also apply this authority to family structures. They outline the concept of complementarianism, arguing that the headship of Christ over the church is the divine model for the home. It calls for the sacrificial leadership of husbands and the submission of wives, reflecting the order of the kingdom in the domestic sphere.
Yeah.
The home is meant to be a micro-representation of the cosmic peace and order established by the king.
Beyond the home, the text addressed the broader psychological climate of our time. When you look at modern anxiety and suicide rates, the cultural despair is palpable. People are terrified of the future. The texts present the literal, physical return of Christ as the only genuine remedy for this overwhelming despair. We do not place our hope in human improvement, societal evolution, or political saviors.
We place our hope in a king who has already conquered death, who brought life out of a dead stump, and who holds the future firmly in his hands.
I want you to think about the stumps in your own life right now. Maybe it is an area of absolute failure, a visible ruin, a broken relationship, or a physical weakness where you feel entirely depleted. The challenge presented by these texts is to rest completely in the sovereign king who brings life out of absolute death, rather than relying on frantic self-help strategies or human pragmatism. If the king of the universe deliberately chose to enter human history through a disgraced, chopped-down family line to prove that salvation belongs entirely to the Lord, how might he be using the apparent ruins in your own life to display his undeniable sovereignty? You look at a dead tree, and biology says it is over, but divine sovereignty says life is just beginning. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Word. We look forward to our next conversation. Farewell until the next edition of Reformed Thinking.